Now, from mass ICE raids across immigrant communities to enforcing anti-DEI policies, fears mount for the melting pot society that the U.S. once championed, slowly unraveling under President Trump. At this moment of social and political upheaval, the dean of the Columbia School of Journalism, Jelani Cobb, told his own students back in March that, quote, "Nobody can protect you. These are dangerous times." Now, through a collection of his articles written over the last decade, he reflects with Michelle Martin on how the United States got to this place.
Thanks, Christiane. Jelani Cobb, thank you so much for talking with us once again.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
So your new book is a collection of your essays. They span from 2012 to 2025. It's titled "Three or More is a Riot." Where does the title come from?
I'd done a lot of coverage that was in and around South Carolina, particularly, one very difficult story that I covered, which was the deaths of 9 African Americans at the Emmanuel AME Church in 2015, the result of a mass shooting that had been orchestrated by a white supremacist. And it reminded me that there had been, years before, the civil code of South Carolina, colonial South Carolina, had held that a slave revolt was defined as 3 or more Negroes, as Black people would have been called then, outside the company of a white man. And then interestingly enough, a lot of civil codes, their definition of riot is public mayhem committed by 3 or more people. And, I thought that there were this line about numbers, demography, social tensions, order, and all those themes that kept coming up in the things I wrote about. And so the title just kind of jumped out at me. It was "Three or More is a Riot."
You start by talking about the shooting death of Trayvon Martin. For many people who may not remember this, he was a Florida teenager. He was shot by a white Hispanic man named George Zimmerman back in 2012, who was sort of a self-appointed neighborhood watchman. Trayvon was visiting his dad. He went out to get his little brother a snack at the convenience store. Zimmerman decided that he was suspicious. He was going to follow him. Trayvon doesn't like being followed, and he feels like he feels threatened. So he confronts Zimmerman. Zimmerman shoots him. He's not arrested for weeks. Public outcry ensues. He's finally arrested, and eventually he's acquitted. And that the irony, of course, that it takes place during the Obama administration.
Right.
Right? And the book kind of follows these sort of different sections. It's got the parameters of hope, winter in America, and history lessons. I was curious, why you decided to open the book with the Trayvon essay, as opposed to, for example, the election of Barack Obama in 2008.
So here's the interesting thing. There were a couple of reasons why the book opens where it does. And, I started writing for The New Yorker in 2012. The first thing I ever wrote about was Trayvon, but it was at that time, it was kind of a news blip. It wasn't a story that had the dimensions that it eventually came to occupy. And so it was the beginning of my relationship with The New Yorker. It was the first thing that I had written about. And then also it occurred to me that when we were putting the collection together, that if we looked at 2012 to 2016, the second term of Barack Obama, then 2016 to 2020, and then 2020 to 2024, it's just a little bit that creeps over into 2025. It could be like a 3-act play, really, with the 3 presidential administrations. You can kind of see an arc of the story evolving and how we came to find ourselves in increasingly volatile social and political circumstances.
It also is interesting to contemplate the question of police violence directed against Black people was such an urgent matter. At least it was urgent to some people. It was urgent to a lot of people. I mean, those Black Lives Matter protests were worldwide. It was remarkable to see people in places that didn't even have large Black populations or expatriate populations of people of African descent engaging in this discourse. What do you think about that now?
I think going back to the point about Obama for a quick second, there's always been this tension between people who were critical of what he did and then other people who were thinking about context, like what was capable of being done in that moment. And that's the kind of tension between really making any kind of assessment of anyone. And so that moment, you know, the forces that were kind of amassing, even while he was in the White House, that were pushing the country in a more volatile direction, in a more reactionary direction. And, you know, people who felt as if he represented something that had been taken from them. And, you know, that was best articulated, best seen, understood in the 2016 election of Donald Trump. And then we go through all of the things that happened in 2016, and then we get to COVID and, you know, some of the more kind of reactionary responses that we get to that. And then there's George Floyd, and there's this high watermark of kind of social reform and recognition of the kind of civil rights dynamics that had been implicit in all these cases that preceded, but you know they hadn't seen someone, the public had not seen someone lose their life over the course of 9 minutes of video with a police officer recalcitrantly refusing to stop kneeling on his neck. And I think that shocked the conscience. But in the long view, 2020 looks like a brief interlude, a speed bump on the way toward a much more reactionary version of the United States. We now live in a society where what happened to George Floyd is more likely, not less likely. And it's a result of these titanic forces that we'd seen amassing long before any of us knew who George Floyd was.
One of the things you write about is the way in which the President Trump has been very good at turning racial grievances, cultural grievances, class grievances into political capital, okay? But why do you think that is, that he's been so successful at it?
I mean, I think some of this is a particular political skill, and I mean, dare I say, even talent at finding the buttons that really trigger rage in people. And, you know, he has a background in television, which shows, you know, in reality TV. And, you know, in some ways, the kind of politic that we've seen him deploy has been, you know, the fundamental with the kind of simplicity level of reality television. And that has been compelling to people. The other thing is that this is a very old playbook. You know, populist movements, particularly reactionary populist movements, if you go back to Pat Buchanan in the 90s or George Wallace in the 1960s, or if you went all the way back to Tom Watson in the 1890s into the early 20th century, and if you took all their speeches and threw the pages up in the air and let them hit the ground, you would have a hard time discerning who was saying what, you know, because there is this big overlap in the kind of ways in which they leverage people's feelings of resentment and, you know, galvanize that into political force.
Yeah, but Pat Buchanan didn't make it to the White House. George Wallace didn't make it to the White House. Certainly not for 2 terms. I mean, not for no terms in their case, and certainly not for 2 terms. And it's just, I don't know. I mean, to kind of be defeated, to win an election, be defeated, and then to come back, that's a pretty remarkable achievement.
Yeah, I'm not doubting that at all.
Yeah.
And so that's the thing that I'm saying, though, like that those kinds of movements have existed for a long time. The dynamic of someone who's able to galvanize that. Also, I should say, none of those people were running for president in the aftermath of a black man being elected president, which is another kind of point, you know, that bears mention.
The book is not exclusively, but it is very much focused on kind of the black-white racial dynamic, in part because of the times that you were writing about. I mean, an African-American president in his second term, a you know, white populist figure arising in part, as you noted, in out of a resentment around that fact. Okay, so in the current moment, though, many of the people who seem to be the focus of this president's resentment are people of other ethnic backgrounds, many people from South America, Central America, many of the people who are the targets of this immigration crackdown, which has taken on these kind of furious dimension. And I was just wondering if that kind of, how you're thinking about that.
Mm-hmm. So I think it's interesting. There's a piece that I wrote in the New Yorker, but it was too recent to actually get into the collection. And there's a couple of other pieces that talk about, this dynamic of immigration and anti-immigration, xenophobia in American society and the kind of high groundswell of it that we're experiencing right now. But one of the things that I would point out is that historically, we've tended to see xenophobic politics rise at the same time that we have seen anti-Black politics. Like those two things seem to have had like a connection that goes to a fundamental concern about demography and trying to curate who is in the United States and therefore who is in the electorate. There are issues of voter access and voter suppression that also tend to go hand in hand with anti-immigration rhetoric, with nativism and xenophobia. And so all of these things, I think, are responding to a common sense of persecution or maybe anxiety about where people fit into the bigger demography of the United States.
In some of your essays, you revisit them, like you have like an epilogue or a postscript where you kind of reflect on what you wrote then and what you might think now. Anyone in particular where you really felt like I kind of got that wrong? I was really wrong.
No, I feel like I got everything right.
Lucky.
No, I think some of my assessments, my early assessments about the MAGA phenomenon, underestimated, one, the broad array of issues that were really kind of buoying that movement. I certainly underestimated the speed at which it was going to come into fruition. And once I started to see it, I couldn't unsee it when I was thinking about it in relationship to older populist movements in the United States. And then it becomes much more legible and much more understandable. But I think early on, I didn't understand that. And so the writing that I did probably reflected that then.
What do you make of the fact that this MAGA movement, this movement that the president has called MAGA, is a multiracial movement? His FBI director, who has been a prime agent of his revenge campaign against his perceived political enemies, is an Indian American who took his oath of office on a Hindu sacred text. What do you make of the fact that the head of one of these kind of militia groups like the Proud Boys has a Hispanic heritage? The fact that he got larger percentages of Hispanic and Black votes in his second election than he did in the first.
Sure.
What do you make of that?
So I think there are a few things that are at play. One is that if we looked at all sorts of kind of movements that preceded this, if we looked at the kind of anti-communist movements of the 1950s and so on, you had people of different backgrounds and different kind of vantage points who also found something that they connected to in those movements. The other thing that I will say that has happened here is that the politics of othering has been kind of like playing off of various counterpoints, if I can say it. The person who, for the larger numbers of Black men, or the larger numbers of Black men who voted for Donald Trump in 2024, were very often responding to the kind of masculinist, and some people thought were sexist politics that Trump represented. And so they weren't voting necessarily on the basis of race, but they were voting about anxieties and resentments that they experienced along the lines of gender. There were people who were women who could have been concerned about the questions about policies that he would have advocated that weren't beneficial to women, but also were more concerned about immigration and ideas and so it was a kind of masterful example of playing people off of each other on the basis of their resentments, their anxieties, and their fears. That's one thing. The other thing is that some of this is not about the increased appeal of Donald Trump. It's about the decreased appeal of the Democratic Party, which, has two huge issues, the extent to which we haven't really sorted in terms of how they factored in to the previous presidential election. But the first was that lots of young voters who were turned off by Gaza and simply didn't come out. And so Trump's proportion of these voters increases because the anticipated turnout on the other side is lower than what had been suspected. And then the other side of it was that when Joe Biden dropped out of the presidential race, there were significant numbers of Democrats who felt that he should not have been able to just hand the nomination to Kamala Harris as if he were passing a torch. And those kinds of resentments and anxieties led people to be, her campaign kind of suffered the brunt of that as well. Not to mention, the fact that this was a campaign for somebody that had 107 days, I think it was, to make a case to the entire 340 million plus population of the United States about why they should be the next leader. I think when you look at it like that, it's probably some combination of all those things and not simply, one group of people decided that Donald Trump was more appealing in 2024 than he had been in 2020 or 2016.
So before we let you go, let's go back to kind of where we started. One of the places we started, which is that you've got several hats, but the journalist hat, the historian hat. Did the experience of going back and looking at your writings from 2012 on, has that changed anything about the way you look at the current moment?
Yeah, it has actually, because one, kind of going back and reading the pieces, and I write these assessments, that look at what I got right, what I got wrong, just as my own assessment. But the other part of it was that it made the patterns that we kind of see that weren't as visible at the time much more legible and visible to me on the other side of it in retrospect. And so that was also something I think I took from going through all of it and going like, oh, wow, this is connected to this and this is connected to that and these things go together and so on.
Jelani Cobb, thank you so much for talking with us.
Thank you.